everybody. This is Nick Burbules. I'm a member of the International Academy of Education. This is another in a series of interviews we're doing with the with authors in the Educational Practices series, a series of short research-based monographs that deal with fairly large and significant issues in education. Today, our guest is Szűcs, who co-authored a book on math anxiety with Irene Mammarella. Dennis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Sure.
I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to talk with you. So let's just dive in. So what is math anxiety, and in what ways is it more than just someone who isn't very good at math, or feels that they aren't very good at math, or isn't interested in math, or doesn't like math? What is math anxiety, and what makes it a problem?
Well, you could just say that math anxiety is the fear of mathematics, fear of doing math, learning math, fear of being evaluated in math. And it's definitely not just not being good in math. So it's often assumed that people only have math anxiety if they are not good in math, but this is absolutely untrue. Actually, our own big investigations have also shown that about 80% of students who have high math anxiety are actually reasonably good or even very good in math. So it seems that most students who have high math anxiety are actually pretty okay in math.
That's interesting. So a key word that you use in the book is debilitating, that it is a debilitating fear or anxiety. Can you say more about why you chose that word, and what are some of the signs we would look for in our students, or even for that matter in our own children, as indicators of math anxiety?
Debilitating refers to the phenomenon that often children with math anxiety just feel very confused, unable to function when they encounter any kind of math. So they try to think, but they can't focus, perhaps. So they are unable to deal with the task at hand, even if they are not extremely complicated sometimes, or they could do them. We would assume they have demonstrated that they can them, but perhaps in some situations they just get too confused. They have this feeling of incapacitation, they can't cope.
And so this is an emotional impediment more than a cognitive impediment, or
Exactly.
Or am I drawing that distinction too broadly?
No, it's more of an emotional problem, not a cognitive problem. We do think, based on our studies, that math anxiety is definitely an emotional issue. It's not a cognitive issue. If you think about what we discussed before, that most children actually are reasonably good with math. Most children who have high math anxiety are reasonably good with math. So this also suggests that they do not have a cognitive issue. It's not that they are just stupid in math. They just have a negative emotional reaction to mathematics.
You make two empirical observations in the booklet that I wanted to pull out and ask you about. One is that girls tend to be more susceptible to this than boys. Can you explain why that's the case? Is it just gender stereotypes? Is there something else going on? Why would girls be more susceptible to this than boys?
Well, we do not know why exactly, but in my experience and looking at international data from very large studies, for example, from the PISA studies, which tested hundreds of thousands of children, also sometimes for math anxiety, it seems clear that girls show considerably higher math anxiety than boys. Why is this so? We do not know. One potential cause may be what you mentioned, stereotypes about mathematics. Math is often considered still to be a male domain, independently of structural gender equality in a country. There are studies about this as well, very interesting ones, showing that actually math anxiety distinction between boys and girls can be really large in countries with high gender equality, girls having higher math anxiety than boys, even in those countries. So gender stereotypes about math may be prevalent in society. We also found that girls show higher general anxiety for everyday life events also than boys. So they don't only show higher math anxiety than boys, they also show higher anxiety in general for everything than boys. That also seems a fairly robust gender difference. So maybe girls are more susceptible to anxiety in general. Actually, we just did a kindergarten study where we also found that already in kindergarten you can measure slightly higher general anxiety for everyday events in girls than boys. It's not clear whether this may have any biological reasons or coming from early socialization already. Girls may be just more stressed by events in general because we teach them to be more stressed. And girls may also be more willing to admit their anxieties. That's another potential option here. So often boys are taught not to admit if they are anxious. They have to be really tough. So when we ask about anxieties in a questionnaire, boys may be more reluctant to admit that they are anxious about school events. And in school, early in school, girls may have higher what we call metacognitive awareness as well than boys. So they may be able to reflect on themselves better than boys, reflect on their own anxiety, recognize that they are anxious. That's another option. So you see, there are various reasons here for why we detect this.
Sorry, what's interesting in what you say is, going back to your earlier point, it doesn't mean necessarily that girls aren't as good at math as boys. That might not necessarily be the case.
Absolutely not. Not in our samples, girls. That's absolutely not the case. So in our samples, for example, which are pretty large, usually more than 1,000 children, girls always had higher math anxiety than boys, but their math performance was exactly the same as the performance of the boys, right? And they were usually even better in reading than boys. So academically, I think international data shows that girls are now usually better than boys, not necessarily in math. In our samples, in math, they were on par with boys. So their worse performance cannot explain their higher anxiety. What is typical in lots of studies, what people find is that girls have much lower confidence in mathematics. What we call self-concept, usually, maybe the more technical term, is lower in girls. So they trust their math abilities much less, even if they perform exactly at the same level as boys.
The other observation you make in this part of the book that really struck me is that teachers themselves may have math anxiety or some degree of math anxiety, and may themselves be communicating some of that to students intentionally or unintentionally, presumably, and that can also be part of this this dynamic.
Exactly, absolutely. There are various studies which have demonstrated this, that the more math anxious teachers are, the more math anxious their students can become. And I think classical studies exactly from the US demonstrated that trainee teachers in the United States tended to have very high math anxiety. Perhaps they trusted their own math abilities less than they thought they should have trusted them. So teachers can definitely demonstrate high math anxiety, which students can pick up.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the last part of the book, which is what to do about it. What are some of the educational interventions or strategies for helping students deal with math anxiety?
Well, it's not clear yet, unfortunately. We definitely need more studies. What we think and what we recommended in the booklet is that probably different populations need different methods to alleviate or perhaps prevent a math anxiety. We distinguish between 3 groups of children. One group is the group of children who are relatively poor in math. They have about double the chance to develop high math anxiety than the general population of children. I think in this population of children who are relatively poor in math, what we need is more math training, some gradual confidence building, but this training shouldn't be kind of mindless drilling. I don't think that would help, because that's not really building confidence, because in that case, children would just do something, but they wouldn't understand why. So unfortunately, I say it's because this requires more time in school. So it's an ironic comment. So children would need to understand what they are doing. So kind of math training which helps them build confidence would probably help them. There are a couple of studies about these. Another group of children is the group of girls who often have high math anxiety, even if their math performance is good, as we just discussed. In their case, probably exposing stereotypes about math may help in secondary school when they can already understand the discussion point. So they shouldn't attribute failure to them, they being girls, for example. So that may be helpful. And the third group is the children who perform relatively well or even fairly well in math, but they are still math anxious. In that case, probably separating performance from anxiety would be useful. So to make them to understand that their anxiety doesn't equal their performance. They may be just anxious, not because they are not good enough, but for other reasons. And anxiety management may help them as well, because some of those children may just not be able to cope with stressful situations. Oddly, I add here that some of those children who are doing reasonably well in math, but they're still very math anxious, may actually be math anxious highly because they value mathematics highly. So the higher value they put on math, the more anxious they will be, because the more they would think that they have to perform really well in that subject, which is very valuable, right? So that's kind of a paradox.
Well, I think, you know the international literature better than I do, but I would imagine that would be particularly a problem in certain countries where performance in math and test scores in math play a really crucial role in life opportunities and educational advancement.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is fairly obvious if you look at the OECD PISA results, for example, from China, Singapore, right? I'm not sure whether you were thinking about this, but those two. Oh, okay. So those students perform extremely well in math. They achieve like 100 points more than everybody else in mathematics. But relative to this huge performance level, this excellent performance level, they are fairly math anxious as well. So most probably, because they are under such pressure, they are very good, but all the competition is excellent. They can't lose a point. 99% performance is not enough. So cultural issues are definitely there, and what we expect from children will determine whether they are anxious or not, of course.
Yeah. At the other end of the spectrum, you make a point in the booklet that also struck me that in some cases there can be a vicious circle where a student has a perception that they're not good at math, or they have math anxiety, and that anxiety itself causes them to underperform, so that it looks like, in fact, they are underperforming. Well, they are underperforming, but not because of a lack of ability or competence, but because the math anxiety itself is becoming what we call sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. So they may start out with a little bit weak performance. They will be anxious that they can't do well enough. This anxiety will make them less focused, perhaps in the next math test, which will lead to worse performance. This will justify the anxiety, and the whole thing will amplify. Or it may start with some increased anxiety, which will impact performance, which will lead to more anxiety. So it's a vicious circle, really, which could build up.
So one last topic on my list. So you've talked about interventions to help students to deal with this. You talked about cognitive behavior therapy, rational emotive therapy, behavioral therapy. But when the teacher themselves has some of these characteristics, what then happens? I mean, how much of this involves teacher self-work, perhaps, in terms of, for example, messages that they may be unconsciously communicating to students? At what level is an intervention at the level of the teacher also necessary?
I think it's very important for teachers to self-reflect, and acknowledge in the first step if they have some kind of anxiety for mathematics, which can be understandable sometimes. Some children may be demanding and they may ask very curious questions, what about the concept of zero or negative numbers? How does it all make sense? And then, so acknowledging this anxiety, and often it may go back to some uncertainties, insecurity about subject knowledge, like the previous more conceptual questions. So working on those questions may help, and probably discussing these issues in the school may be helpful with more experienced colleagues, sharing responses to these disturbing questions children can ask. So teachers' confidence could be boosted as well.
Sure. Dinesh, thank you very much for this discussion. It's been really informative. It's a really important topic internationally, as you made clear. It's a really important issue in many countries. It takes different forms in different contexts, perhaps. But thank you to you and Irene as well for bringing this issue to our attention.
Thank you very much for this opportunity